Hello everyone and welcome to this live session today held by ClimaTalk. This is our penultimate live stream discussion. Today we're going to be focusing on the developments and the disappointments from COP26 regarding transport and accounting for importation. I'm Amy Wilson and I'm the COP26 team lead at ClimaTalk. ClimaTalk is a youth-led non-profit organisation that seeks to demystify climate policy and amplify young people's voices in the fight against climate change. I'm so excited today to be joined by two of our in-house trackers, Roxana and Kat, here with me today, who have respectively been tracking transport and imports and exports. I'm also really excited that last minute we have been joined by two of our members at COP, Jack and Charlie, who are sat in the stands waiting to join our discussion too. These chats are really informal. The first 20 minutes are going to be about transport and we'll be taking views from Roxana and Jack and Charlie. And then we'll move on to imports and exports in the latter 20 minutes. So today we're going to begin with transport. When we discuss transport, we are thinking about the inclusion of passenger vehicles, freight, aviation, shipping, and even active modes of transport. Transport accounts for a vast proportion of our global emissions and has often been viewed as one of the ways that we can quickly remove our emissions. So Roxana, what aspects of transport did COP26 consider during the negotiations and the events?
So judging from the policy briefings, the declaration and the many pledges that have been made, mostly cars and vans, medium and heavy good vehicles, shipping and aviation have been covered, but there has been a very distinct lack of public transport and public alternatives to individual transportations.
Great. So just to delve into a little bit deeper on passenger vehicles, what do you think was the biggest progress at COP26? And was the infrastructure needed for electrification of vehicles discussed at COP?
Yes, so there have been two main pledges / declarations. So the UK has made its own zero emission pledge for 2040 to have all new road vehicles in the UK be set to zero emissions and have all new heavy good vehicles that are sold from 2040 to be also zero emission vehicles. And part of how they're planning on addressing this design, the infrastructure to provide for these cars is that they unveiled their new charge port design, which is a concept that should prioritize the inclusivity and ease of use, and apparently has been very necessary because there have apparently the UK has only one charge point per every 27.2 electric vehicles, which is the worst ratio of the 12 countries and 2 US states that were included in recent data collection. So it is very necessary to provide this infrastructure, and this is a way they're trying to address this. The second interesting declaration has been by 32 countries and 6 major vehicle manufacturers, as well as 28 fleets and 13 investors, which have all jointly set out their determination for all new car and van sales to be zero emission by 2040 globally for all markets and 2035 in leading markets. So the goal is to make zero emission vehicles the new normal. What's a bit worrying is that the US, Germany, and China have not signed this declaration at this stage, and they are the 3 largest car markets, although businesses and cities and regions in these geographies have, so we will have to see how that progresses. Other than that, there has been another agreement by 15 countries that have signed a memorandum of understanding for zero emissions on medium and heavy duty vehicles. So this new global memorandum of understanding for zero emission for heavy and medium duty vehicles is supposed to have an interim goal of 30% of zero emission new vehicle sales by 2030. And there has also been a separate launch of a Count Us In Citizens Declaration, which is calling on world leaders to ensure that only zero emission vehicles are sold in the bus space by 2030. Other than that, there has been the Zero Emission Vehicle Transit Council that has now published its first 2022 priority annual action plan, which is supposed to set out areas for sustained international cooperation to accelerate the transition towards these new zero emission vehicles. And they also include an infrastructure mention because they want to also include charging infrastructure as one of the main priorities to create a collective vision for global charging infrastructure for light and heavy duty vehicles. And they're planning on launching a task force for that. Other than that, there have been several launches of global and equitable transition funding initiatives, for example, by the World Bank or the UK government. But so mostly it's very visible that the emphasis on cars and vans and heavy duty vehicles has been dominating COP so far, considering all of these different pledges, which have mostly stayed at the level of pledges.
Okay, great for that insight. I think an important consideration is definitely the infrastructure surrounding electrification, because we can only definitely get a lot of cars on the road and people using them if the infrastructure supports their use. So it's good to hear that there's been movement on both those. One area that often gets brought up, Jack and Charlie, is that the military transportation is not included in discussions. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit and how we should be thinking about them?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So just in considering the scale of military emissions, the military actually accounts for 6% of global emissions. To give some sort of comparison, Russia, the entire country of Russia, contributes to 5% of global emissions. So military impact on global emissions is really, really huge. And countries actually don't have to include the emissions from the military in their national targets. It's voluntary, and of course, most countries choose not to so that they can present more ambitious targets. And this is really a big loophole, especially for countries who are large military spenders. The US, China, the UK, Russia, India, France, and Saudi Arabia are sort of the biggest ones. So there's some aspect of inequity there. It's those that are sort of boosting the military industrial complex the most who actually don't have to account for those emissions. And there's really been no discussion about that. I mean, it was not necessarily expected at COP, but it's certainly something that should happen if we are to tackle emissions in a serious way. And like I said, sort of in an expected way, it was not covered at COP, but it's important to remember it in our minds, in the back of our minds when we're addressing these issues of transport, that this is a huge sector that's actually being left out of the discussion entirely.
Definitely, and I think that aligns with a lot of discussions about what to include in NDCs and what is not included in NDCs, and how we understand whether we're meeting the 1.5 degree goal or not. So yeah, thank you, Jack, for that insight. So then moving on to aviation and shipping, Roxana, how were these included in the discussions? Because often they are left out. And how did COP26 try and address this?
Yes, so maybe to start with shipping, as it accounts for 90% of world trade related transport, it is a main concern, and there has been the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study 2020, which did find that if no further action is taken, international shipping emissions are expected to represent 90 to 130% of emission levels by 2050. So there's definitely concern in this area, and this has been addressed by at least 19 governments that have stated the intent to support the establishment of so-called green shipping corridors, which was done in the ClimaTalk's Declaration. And this basically means that they want to establish zero emission shipping routes between two ports. And this declaration sits within the zero emission shipping mission and is designed to complement the work at the International Maritime Organization to enable the establishment of zero emission shipping. And what they aim is to collectively support the establishment of at least 6 green corridors by the middle of the decade and then expand to more. And also they want to involve zero emission vessel technologies and use alternative fuel and implement a charging infrastructure in place in ports to allow for zero emission shipping on key routes. So there seems to be some movement in this area. Additionally, there's been the private sector that has announced that it is now convening with 200 businesses and has been with 150 since September. And they issued a call for policymakers urging them to support like large-scale projects in the shipping and transport area. But generally, it's very still zero emission and net zero focused. So it's still unclear how widely used this will be, since it's only been 19 governments so far.
We'll have to maybe look to COP27 to see if further shipping is brought into climate negotiations, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, should we move on to aviation, see how that was considered?
Yeah, so there it's been 14 to 18 states, some reports will vary, but let's be generous and say 18 states that have that are representing the 40% of global aviation's emissions that have committed to working together to achieve the ambitious new aviation decarbonization target. So basically they committed towards net zero CO2 emission by 2050. And they want to do this through the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a part of the new International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition. Very nice, fancy name. And this has been signed by various countries, like the typical countries like Canada, France, but also by the Maldives, Kenya, and Burkina Faso. And additionally, there has been some movement in the private sectors this morning, since apparently the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance has opened to new members for the first time. So it seems like the private sector is also interested in joining those efforts. To what extent we will see, but yes, so there has been a declaration in this area as well.
Do you think it's difficult for shipping and aviation because no one country obviously has control over the oceans and the skies? Do you think it's harder to come to agreements on aviation and shipping?
I mean, in terms of, yeah, I mean, both aviation and shipping are like huge factors in the globalized economy. So it makes sense that some countries are apprehensive. It's like Germany with the car market. I'm not surprised that they haven't signed it yet. Some countries really do invest and rely a lot on these infrastructures, and changing them, I imagine, can seem uncomfortable, but it's very necessary, which is why only 19 or 18 states having signed it is not a great sign so far, but hopefully there can be more and like lobbying towards other countries. But I mean, it's one of the areas where resistance is definitely something that I would have expected. And I mean, we're seeing that in the relatively low numbers of states represented in these declarations. And not to mention, they are still only declarations. So even though they have committed, if they will follow through is a different situation in itself.
I think with the Paris Agreement being a voluntary process and declarations obviously being a voluntary process, yeah, it's quite hard to follow through with them potentially sometimes. But I guess we need to have criteria that assesses progress on these declarations. That's great to get an insight into the three sort of like large areas that people often do discuss in relation to transport. One of the things that I believe is often left out is active travel, such as walking, cycling. Can you maybe expand on how these were discussed at COP26 or how they were not?
Yeah, 100%. So it's interesting because there has been some mentioning of active travel by the UK Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, who said that, for example, flying should be guilt-free and that aviation is not the ultimate evil. So like commercial flying and so on, there's like still some apprehension towards this area, and I imagine he wants consumers to not feel pressured. However, I am a bit surprised that the focus of this COP has not been more on public transport and alternatives like cycling or walking and generally public infrastructure. There have been protesters outside of COP that were doing a bike protest in order to call for more infrastructure. And despite the fact that the Scottish government has now announced free bus travel for all age 22 and under, that should be in place in early 2022, there is a very distinct lack of really like heavy discussions of infrastructure funding and financing. And I mean, a lot of especially urban infrastructure could really benefit and be an easy target for renewal and making it more attractive for people to use public infrastructure or cycle to work or wherever they're going would be something that, especially in urban areas, would be easy to do. So it's worrying in the sense that I wonder if maybe part of that apprehension is because it's not as exciting and funding attracting as something like electric cars or these types of like new charging infrastructure, which obviously does still give the industry a lot of focus, whereas public transport would fall on the backs of governments and local councils. And so it's really something that has to be put more into the forefront. And there have been there's been a lot of backlash about this as well on Twitter, for example, by Greenpeace. I've been checking the reactions, and people are really like across the board noticing this general lack of active travel. And that's not to say that individual solutions are the only ones, but it's something that would be very easy to implement. And I think it's just another area where there's a lack of somewhat business interest perhaps, and so not as much discussion, but hopefully considering the efforts of other groups and NGOs and the public itself, there might be some more push for it, at least in the UK. So we will see where it goes.
Great, yeah, and I think one of the biggest factors is probably behavioural change and trying to encourage more of the public to get involved with public transport or walking and cycling. Maybe Charlie or Jack, you could touch on the importance actually of behavioural change and moving away from dependency on cars and aviation.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that when considering this, we have to understand the scale of the transport sector. It's an incredibly carbon intensive sector, and it's actually transport activity is set to double by 2050. And considering that sort of trajectory, that growth of the transport sector, you can understand that the sort of solutions that are being discussed here at COP in terms of setting net zero targets or innovation in the form of electrification or development of new fuels like hydrogen is really insufficient to tackle the scale of that project. And if we do choose to tackle the growing transport industry by only focusing on these solutions, we run into real issues of justice as well, which I think Charlie can touch on a little bit. But just before that, to provide one example of something that is discussed outside of these halls, but hasn't really been talked about so much within COP, is a solution, for instance, like a frequent flyers tax. I mean, when it comes to aviation, 1% of people are accountable for 50% of aviation emissions. So I think that if we implemented a frequent flyer tax, that'd be one way, for example, that we could tackle the issue of transport which is different from the discussions happening here.
Yeah, and I just wanted to sort of jump on and reiterate, these points about the fact that there's far too much focus on electrification and specifically on cars. And especially when you're looking at, the climate crisis as a global issue, often because obviously it's national governments talking here, they're discussing what they're doing in terms of their NDCs or their national transport plans without really thinking or discussing their global supply chains. And we went to a really interesting People Summit event a couple of days ago, where there was an activist from Brazil, and she was making the point that Germany's Green Party has recently been saying lots about electrifying their public transport and how they're going net zero and all these goals. And she was saying they're mentioning nothing about where they're getting the minerals from to be able to actually create this transition. When you're talking about lithium, cobalt, and she's saying that's coming from the Congo, that's coming from Chile. And often this is from indigenous lands or from land grabbing. So it's not enough to be talking about it on really quite a small scale when you're just looking in one country, because we need to be looking at it from a much more global perspective. And I also with the focus on electrification is that we often forget that transport and energy intersect so much that when you have all these vehicles or public transport that's electrified, you need to make sure that the national grid is also at a place of low carbon emissions. And too many countries, especially, for example, like India, China, or the US, are so coal reliant still in their systems that some studies have actually shown that for some drivers in the US, driving an electric vehicle is actually worse for the environment because of where they're getting their electricity from than if they were just driving a petrol car, which really sort of highlights again why you can't just focus on one sector one part of transport. And I think the final thing I'd highlight in this section is that I think where we're not seeing enough action in terms of shipping and aviation, I think part of that comes against this fact that too much focus is just what's happening on electrifying cars. And if, COP26 is any sort of show of what's happening out in the broader world. I mean, yesterday at Transport at the British Pavilion, they had this brand new electric truck that was their main thing that they were showcasing for Transport Day. And over these 2 weeks, we had a Formula One car in the main corridor of the Blue Zone that has again been a big exhibit. And I think that is probably one of the reasons that the Transport Day has been so dampened down, that there's not enough discussion, because really it's all been focused on sort of science and innovation, which has probably already been taken up in previous days, where we need to really broaden out the discussion and be thinking about all these other areas of transport that Roxana and Jack have been highlighting. We need to really be thinking much more broadly about this sector.
Definitely. And I think thinking about energy use, resources, but also like health. I know from my research that electric cars have been shown to produce more particulate matter than petrol and diesel cars as well, which obviously you then bring on a health aspect to the focus of just electrification. Whereas, if we're thinking about cycling and walking, we potentially don't cause those issues as so significantly. So I think it's important that we broaden our conversational topic in terms of transport. Definitely. I think that nicely brings us on to close this first part of our discussion and move on to imports and exports. So thank you very much, Roxana, for your insight and tracking during COP26 over transport. It's been really great to hear the progress, and hopefully more progress to come in the coming days and ahead of COP27. So thank you very much for joining us. So I move across to Kat now with imports and exports. Can you, Kat, maybe give a brief overview of what we mean by accounting for imports and exports at COP26 and obviously within country NDCs?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several climate issues involved in accounting for imports and exports, but I'll focus primarily on two of them, but there are three that I'll just briefly cover. The first and most simple factor is the fact that the CO2 emissions from international aviation involved in shipping imports and exports are not accounted in a country's NDCs. So those are goods that they are consuming, that's greenhouse gas emissions associated with a country's consumption, which just aren't accounted for in their NDCs. And as we will see throughout this section of the discussion, that's a consistent theme, is the absence of counting greenhouse gas emissions associated with imports and exports. So that leads me on to my second factor, and I think that's probably the most concerning, which is the fact that countries, often Western countries who consume a lot of goods produced in countries abroad, consume huge amounts of carbon-intensive goods, as I say, produced in countries other than themselves that they then import in. So these goods wouldn't have been produced if it weren't for the demand of the consumer countries. And those goods are immediately shipped to consumer countries after production. So just to really re-emphasize, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing those goods wouldn't exist if it weren't for the demand of the consumer country. And yet, the carbon emissions associated with that production have to be accounted for by the producer countries' NDCs and their carbon inventories. And this essentially allows consumer countries to free ride on carbon-intensive production elsewhere in the world. It also means that producer countries have carbon emissions affect their performance on greenhouse gas emissions, even though they aren't the ones who get to sort of use the products that are the outcome of this production. So this can enable consumer countries to claim that they are green, to ostensibly reduce their greenhouse gas emissions without actually making any meaningful change in their consumption, because they are importing their carbon-intensive goods from abroad. And I mean, I think this essentially allows consumer countries to kind of have their cake and eat it, to claim they are green while also continuing to consume huge volumes of carbon-intensive goods and continue with the consumer economy structure. The last factor is slightly different, and it's so-called carbon leakage. And that's come to the fore as an economic concern for countries who are seeking to transition to low carbon economies. Particularly, the EU has brought this to a head under its Fit for 55 package. And the EU has started talking a lot about carbon leakage as part of its efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, hence reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Carbon leakage, because it's a kind of jargony term that doesn't really make sense unless you kind of explain it first, is the concern that if a country, let's say country A, imposes tax on carbon emissions, hence increasing the cost of carbon-intensive goods production, production of those carbon-intensive goods may be relocated to countries which have more lax environmental regulations, and we'll kind of call those country B for the purposes of this extended metaphor. Consumers in country A could then, in theory, import the good for a low price from country B. So as a result of having introduced environmental regulations, country A has therefore lost the tax revenue that would have been associated with that production and the kind of real GDP value from selling those goods. In essence, country A gets a competitive disadvantage in international trade due to having introduced environmental regulations. Again, in this extended metaphor, the EU is country A, and it's concerned about introducing environmental regulations and taxes on carbon, and that leading to the outsourcing of production to other countries with more lax environmental regulations. So those are kind of the three overarching issues. I'll be focusing very much on those latter two, because we've already talked about aviation a bit with Roxana. So yeah, over to you again.
Thanks for that overview. I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about them. So taking all that into stock and knowing what we're talking about, how has COP26 taken this on board? Obviously, you've spoken there about the EU and the EU's considering. Was this brought to the table at COP26?
Yeah, so my research over, the past week or so, but also especially over the past day with transport being on the table at COP26, is that this really hasn't been part of discussions in any significant way. The EU in particular has, of course, recognised that it can and does import goods from carbon-intensive producers in other countries. But this conversation hasn't got further than carbon leakage, which the EU is hoping to address through its carbon border adjustment mechanism, which you can see on the slide here, and of which I will explain more in a moment. But kind of just, I think the most concerning issue here, that issue of consumer countries importing carbon-intensive goods without having to account for those greenhouse gas emissions in their own NDCs, that's received really little meaningful attention. And And I mean, that's despite quite compelling research in this area over the past year. The University of Leeds found that emissions, consumption-based emissions from countries other than the UK, account for 46% of the UK's carbon footprint. And yet those aren't accounted for in our national reporting or, crucially, in the UK's net zero target. And this kind of, has broader implications for how close we are to achieving 1.5 degrees. Between 1990 and 2016, emissions within the UK's borders, so from production within the UK, reduced by 41%, which seems, like some progress. But the consumption-based footprint, so when you take into account the goods we are importing from other countries that have greenhouse gas emissions associated with them, that only dropped 15%, so considerably less. And the picture is even more stark for countries like Switzerland, which depend heavily on imports. Switzerland's CO2 emissions are 209% higher once you take CO2 emissions and CO2 imports, into account. And again, just quickly, between 1990 and 2014, the CO2 emissions associated with production inside Switzerland fell by 11%. But actually, when you take into account consumption and the consumption of goods produced in other countries, the CO2 emissions associated with Switzerland increased by 44%. So again, Switzerland is able to ostensibly boast that it has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions, but when you take into account its consumption and importing of goods which have greenhouse gas emissions associated with them, its CO2 emissions have actually increased. And I mean, as such, accounting for imports and exports kind of intersects with many of the most uncomfortable issues for country delegations at COP26. The issues with the consumption-dependent nature of our economies, the tensions between the global north and the global south in kind of relative responsibilities for the climate crisis, and the need for greater transparency. And there's very little momentum to address this at the moment. Just before we move on quickly, the UK delegation seemed incredibly ill-equipped to talk about these issues at COP26 as well. In a committee meeting, for example, quite recently, the Department for International Trade in the UK stated that it expected international trade would not be heavily featured in COP26. And, having just run through all those major problems with the way we talk about international trade in climate policy and in climate accounting and carbon accounting, the fact that the Department for International Trade went into COP26 assuming it wasn't going to talk about these things doesn't really bode well for how we are addressing them. And indeed, Angus MacNeil, the chair of the International Trade Committee in the UK, has openly acknowledged that there is kind of very little proactive alignment between the environmental and trade agendas. So to summarize that in a sentence, I don't think COP26 has really been a success story in my books when it comes to kind of imports and exports accounting.
Which is such a shame to hear after some of those figures that you stated that, we are definitely not on target as countries to meeting those net zero targets if we're not considering imports. So I guess to move on to something that might be a bit more hopeful in this field is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And can you maybe expand on what it is and why it's hoping to be introduced? Because I'm aware that there was pushback from COP26 to not introduce it so quickly because they didn't want to discuss it at COP26.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think carbon border adjustment mechanisms are going to be wrought with quite a lot of conflict and tension over the next few years. And as I said, at the start, this has very much come to a head because of the EU's desire to introduce its carbon border adjustment mechanism, which for all intents and purposes, I will call CBAM because it's less of a mouthful. And this relates to that problem of carbon leakage that we were talking about, that concern among countries with environmental regulations that carbon intensive production will be shipped elsewhere. So the European Commission adopted CBAM in July 2021. So prior to COP26, but I believe certainly with an eye to kind of using COP26 to talk about CBAM and try and get people on side with regard to it. And the idea of CBAM, this border adjustment mechanism, is essentially it functions as a carbon tariff, so a tax on an import. And the idea is that carbon-intensive goods imported into the EU will face an additional tax, a carbon tariff, essentially, to equalize the price of carbon between domestic products, which are in theory produced in a more environmentally friendly way, and imports, to essentially achieve the goal of not undermining the EU's own production by introducing environmental regulations. It's also hoping to sort of act as a slightly sort of soft power tactic to encourage industries outside the EU to take steps in the same direction. So there's, I suppose, a positive to be seen in that it is trying to encourage other countries to look to introduce more environmentally friendly regulations themselves, and internal carbon taxes as well. Exactly as you said, there have been issues with implementing CBAM. There've been issues with talking about it, and as a result, it's not going. I mean, if it ever does become fully operational, 6 years, 5 years is a long time. We'll see how these conversations progress, but it won't be fully operational until 2026 if it does come to fruition. And once that definitive system is in place, EU importers will have to declare annually the amount of embedded emissions in the goods that they are importing. So by embedded emissions, it's just what I'm talking about with sort of throughout the whole of this, which is those CO2 emissions in another country that were associated with the production of that good. Pragmatically, there are many implementation difficulties, let alone the political tensions, in terms of sort of quantifying how much carbon emissions are associated with particular goods or imports. But that's kind of a brief summary of what CBAM is trying to do. It's trying to act as a kind of carbon tariff.
Great, and we will have to see, I guess, like you say, over the next 5 years to see where the discussions go. But I was just wondering what some of the failings with CBAM might be in terms of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, which are very voluntary things, whereas the CBAM obviously is quite controlling and definitive.
Definitely, and I think the problem with CBAM, one of the problems with CBAM, is that it sort of goes against quite a lot of the spirit of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Of course, that's not to say it's not ostensibly good to try and encourage other countries to reduce their own carbon emissions, and it's not. Yeah, it's of course good to encourage those things and good to kind of facilitate ways to move towards low carbon production in your own country. But the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement at their core are quite based on the notion that developing countries should bear a lesser burden than developed countries in tackling the climate crisis. And, that's been a theme of climate change politics since the 20th century, as long as climate change politics has existed, that the least economically developed nations, especially from the global south, argue that developed nations created climate change through their historic economic growth, and developing nations should not see their own development curtailed as a result of green measures. And that fundamental conflict, which, as I say, is a historic one and has run through climate change politics for decades now, sort of rears its head again in CBAM. Because rather than exploring those nuances and those complexities and those politics, the CBAM states that countries essentially either align with the EU on their regulations of greenhouse gas emissions or bear extra charges on their exports to the EU. As you say, it's sort of, this is a complex area of climate change politics with so many stakeholders whose voices need to be heard. And the CBAM kind of sort of wades in and declares that, a carbon tariff will be put on imports into the EU in a way that's quite kind of concrete and awkward and doesn't account for all these sort of different needs in the macro economy. I guess it's worth noting that CBAM has led to Turkey ratifying the Paris Agreement. At COP26, the Turkish envoy said they wouldn't have ratified Paris if it weren't for CBAM, as they depend on the EU economically. 48% of Turkey's exports go there. And if the tariff on goods produced in countries with low carbon regulations, i.e. high carbon emissions, leads to reduced demand for products from these countries, there is, of course, in economic theory, an incentive for these countries to increase their environmental regulations. And it's obviously kind of, in theory, again, a helpful market adjustment to make low carbon production more competitive. Making the free market work for the environment is ostensibly and in theory not a bad thing. There's a big but here. And it's that the CBAM kind of, again, as I say, conflicts with the notion that developing nations should not pay the price of transitioning to low carbon economies. It was rightly emphasized at an event put on by the European Parliament yesterday that CBAM could easily become punitive, and it's important that it doesn't. Crucially, if the EU is going to penalize developing countries for not transitioning to low carbon economies, which they would be doing by putting a tax on imports from those countries, then the EU also needs to be supporting capacity building in developing countries, whether that's through finance, I think crucially through finance, to enable those countries to make those transitions. Because ultimately, developing countries need more money to tackle the climate crisis. They don't need punitive tariffs. And that's something which I don't think is being broadly spoken about. The Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies did a study on this in 2020, which rightly said that CBAM could bring severe economic consequences to countries who lack the resources to make the change to the low carbon paradigm. And so, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies said that the EU should consider and involve third country, i.e. developing nation stakeholders in CBAM policy design, and also to use revenues from CBAM to fund decarbonisation in at-risk countries, and also use that money to build better emissions reporting. So if the money from it goes to the right place, perhaps there are additional merits to be talked about there, but CBAM alone does not, as I say, fit the brief, I feel, of what Paris and the UNFCCC are trying to achieve in terms of balancing responsibilities for tackling the climate crisis.
Thanks for that. I think that goes back to our transparency again, that there needs to be discussions throughout the development of policies that includes all stakeholders and not just the people in their country. For example, it needs to involve all stakeholders that are going to be affected by such policy. So yeah, I think that's really important. So then just to kind of conclude and hopefully have some optimism for imports and exports, how do we look at the progress towards COP27, and what would we be looking for COP27?
Yeah, so I think, as I said before, the gradual implementation of CBAM over the next few years will no doubt bring a lot of these conflicts to a head, because the complaints and problems which I've outlined are not at the moment, especially headline issues. I think it remains that the main problem in this area of imports and exports at the moment is the absence of any momentum or desire to account for emissions which result from goods bought from producer countries. And there remains a gaping hole in NDC accounting, as we've talked about, again, which disproportionately penalizes developing countries. But looking to, the next year, and this is speculative because I think there is genuinely very little incentive for countries to acknowledge, oh, hey, we're not actually anywhere close to achieving our NDCs, or not anywhere as close as we originally said we were. There's very little incentive for countries to be that upfront and that transparent about the implications of carbon intensive imports. But I wonder if the announcement of the US and China collaboration on climate might allow some more of these issues to be raised. China and Russia are two of the most powerful export-dependent countries in the world, and they have not to this point been greatly involved in COP26 negotiations, at least insofar as neither president attended Glasgow. But if China becomes more involved in climate negotiations and talking about Paris and how to collectively achieve Paris, it could leave the door further open to these issues regarding the inequity of import accounting, because it's of course in China's interest that importer countries account for those carbon emissions in their own NDCs rather than in China's carbon inventories. So there's a ways to go in terms of bringing this conversation into achieving net zero, but certainly CBAM and hopefully greater US-China collaboration should bring these issues more transparency, should shed a light on them in a way which hopefully means they don't remain kind of ignored for the foreseeable.
Thanks very much, Kat, for that insight. And I guess we now turn to Jack and Charlie to hear what is this US-China document that was released yesterday during the Transport Day?
Yeah, so this was announced yesterday on Wednesday, and it's called the China-US Joint Glasgow Declaration on Enhancing Climate Action. And despite that being a sort of long, cumbersome title, it actually is quite accurate about an accurate reflection of what this agreement is. It's really an agreement between the two countries to collaborate on climate action, particularly and crucially in this next decade, so in the 2020s and up to 2030. That's really important because this has been identified as sort of the decisive decade on climate action. And although that might seem a little bit vague, that they've just sort of agreed to greater collaboration, it actually is significant, partly for what Kat was speaking about in terms of CBAM, but also in other things. So for instance, Article 6, when it comes to Article 6, US and China disagreement has been a major sticking point. So this really sort of, I guess, it provides the groundwork to potentially move past some of these sticking points and actually have some action. It also, pretty importantly, provides some leadership. I mean, demonstrates to the rest of countries that the two largest economies and largest greenhouse gas emitters are committed to working together. And that sort of sends a signal that other countries should follow suit in working collaboratively and can really understand that these two countries are committed to climate action, which is really important. It is unfortunate that this comes on the second to last day of COP. It would have been great if this came earlier in the week and perhaps could have pushed the discussions on a little bit further. Charlie and I were in a sort of ministerial meeting this morning where Alex Sharma was pretty pressingly saying that we need to move fast on a lot of the issues that are outstanding still, given that there's only one day left. So perhaps if this agreement had come a little bit earlier, that would have been great. And also, I think we do need to see it followed up really with more concrete pledges and agreements between the two, so that it is not just a commitment to collaboration, but really is transformed into action.
Definitely, and I think it came as a bit of a surprise to quite a few people. I don't think many of the people watching COP26 were expecting a document like it to come out. So let's hope, you know, the next 48 hours we get a fair few more surprises in terms of adoption and agreements at the last stages of COP26. But yeah, thanks very much for that insight into the document that was released yesterday. That is all for this live session today. Huge thank you to Kat, Roxana, Jack and Charlie for joining me today to discuss transport and exports and imports. Come along tomorrow for a final live session, which will look at the built environment, but also a quick recap on what has happened over the 2 weeks and our key takeaways for COP26. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much.